One of the most influential inventions to ever appear in America was the railroad. From its humble beginnings as an alternative to canal transport, to its role in providing jobs to thousands of American men, to its part in lining the pockets of big business in the industrial age, the railroads have changed the way in which America works. The first commercial American railroad, known as the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, appeared in 1828 during the presidency of John Quincy Adams. The railroad, which was built to overcome the trade lost to New York via the Erie Canal, cut through the Appalachian Mountains to connect Baltimore to the Midwest. It wasn't long before the railroads were spreading out across the country, beginning in major eastern cities like New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. By 1860, America had 30,000 miles of railroad track that stretched out almost one-third of the way across the United States, three-quarters of which existed in the industrialized North. There were those that opposed the railroads, including those that invested in canals. To protect commerce on the Erie Canal, the New York legislature in 1833 banned railroads from carrying freight for the time being. Railroads were also considered somewhat of a danger to the public, with flying sparks that could ignite haystacks and houses and fatal railway accidents. Even so, as train technology improved, America soon found itself with the Pullman Sleeping Palace in 1859. One of the greatest incentives for the expansion of railway transport was the acquisition of California and Oregon after the Mexican War. Railroad promoters in both the North and the South had proposed routes to the Pacific coast, but cost required that there be only one route. Whichever region the railroad began in would acquire vast wealth, population, and influence. The South clamored for the rights to the railroad. Secretary of War Jefferson Davis appointed South Carolina Railroad man James Gadsden as minister to Mexico. With this new position, Gadsden was able to negotiate with the Mexican government for the Gadsden Purchase, a strip of land in the southern New Mexico Territory, at the cost of $10 million in 1854. This became a bargaining tool for the South in the railroad debate, since their route, opposed to that of the North, would run entirely through organized territory. This caused the North, particularly Senator Stephen Douglas of Illinois, to work towards splitting the territory of Nebraska into the territories of Nebraska and Kansas. The conflict between the North and South over who would get to own the Transcontinental Railroad's territory ended when the South seceded in the 1850s, allowing the North to become the railroad's terminus. In 1862, Congress began to put into motion the construction of the Transcontinental Railroad, known as the Union Pacific Railroad, with the Pacific Railroad Act. The railroad would stretch from Omaha, Nebraska to the West Coast. The government granted the railroad company 20 square miles of land for each mile of track constructed, with federal loans ranging from $16,000 to $48,000 per mile, depending on the terrain. The progress of construction quickened at the end of the Civil War in 1865. The Credit Mobilier Company slyly pocketed $73 million for $50 million worth of construction, some of which was used to bribe congressmen to act ignorant of misconduct. Congress granted 155,504,994 acres of land to both the Union Pacific Railroad Company and the Central Pacific Railroad Company, whose track began in Sacramento, California, and would eventually connect to the Union Pacific Railroad. Much of the construction work on the Union Pacific Railroad was performed by Irish Paddies, veterans of the Union Army. Many other minority groups found jobs with the railroads, including the 10,000 Chinese workers in the West, who worked on the Central Pacific Railroad. These workers faced incredibly dangerous conditions that resulted in the deaths of hundreds due to premature explosions and other accidents. Not everyone was in favor of the railroad's construction. As construction on the Transcontinental Railroad continued, Native Americans attacked laborers in an attempt to defend their land. Meanwhile, white hunters were hired to shoot buffalo, the source of sustenance for the Plains Indians, for meat to feed the railroad crews. Buffalo were also shot for sport, severely depleting their numbers. The combination of permanent railroad tracks, loss of trees for railroad ties and bridges, and hunting of wild game caused the buffalo to become almost extinct in the late 1870s, with only 1,000 residing in the West by the end of the 1800s. With the loss of the buffalo and Native American lands came the consolidation of Native peoples into reservations. The Union Pacific and Central Pacific Railroads finally met near Ogden, Utah on May 10, 1869. A large ceremony was held that included breaking champagne bottles and driving a final spike made of gold into the track. The The Union Pacific had contributed 1,086 miles to the railroad, while the Central Pacific had built 689 miles. The completion of this line is considered one of America's most astonishing peacetime undertakings, and it played a large part in uniting the West Coast to the Union, leading to increased trade with Asia. It wasn't long before other transcontinental lines were constructed. By the turn of the century, 4 other lines had joined the ranks. The Northern Pacific Railroad, which stretched from Lake Superior to Puget Sound, was completed in 1883. The Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railroad, which crossed through the southwestern deserts to California, and the Southern Pacific Railroad, which ran from New Orleans to San Francisco, were completed in 1884. The Great Northern Railroad, which was built north of the Northern Pacific and stretched from Duluth to Seattle, was completed in 1893. Not all of America's railroads thrived. Sometimes the locations of the tracks were so remote that the project would have to be abandoned, leading to bankruptcy for the builders and severe financial losses for the investors. Many large railroads after the Civil War went through waves of bankruptcies, mergers, and reorganizations. The largest consolidation occurred at the hands of Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt, a millionaire who worked to unite the Eastern Railroad networks, primarily the New York Central. Vanderbilt managed to earn $100 million by providing cheaper, more superior railway service, making him the first real railway baron of the American industrial age. 2 major improvements made the train the primary mode of transportation for most Americans. The first was the steel rail, which Vanderbilt made famous by using it as a replacement for New York Central's iron tracks. Steel was safer, more economical, and more durable than iron. The second improvement was the Westinghouse air brake, adopted in the 1870s, which made trains safer and more efficient. The railroads had a tremendous effect on the American economy, catalyzing the growth of the post-Civil War years. Train tracks, like stitches, sewed the entire country together for the first time. The railroads became the nation's biggest employer, providing more jobs than any other industry and consuming almost 20% of investment dollars for both foreign and domestic investors. They were able to transport a gold mine of raw materials from the West to factories in the East. The products of these factories would then be transported to every corner of the continent, making the United States the largest integrated national market in the world. The railroads also gave a huge boost to the steel industry. They played a huge role in stimulating mining and agriculture in the West by transporting farmers to farms, farm products to markets, and manufactured goods to the Pacific coast. Railroads also had a huge impact on urbanization, American immigration, and westward expansion. People used the railways to settle in cities. Railroad companies advertised in Europe to convince people to immigrate to America, where they could then buy land grants and increase railway business. Some railroad companies even offered to transport the immigrants to their farms at no cost. Settlers stretched out along the Midwest and the West, replacing the buffalo population with that of range-fed cattle and depleting forests for wood to build houses and fences. Settlers constructed towns in their newfound homelands, and increased populations led to the founding of several states. Colorado became a state in 1876, followed by the Dakotas, Montana, and Washington in 1889. Wyoming and Idaho joined the Union in 1890. Utah became a state in 1896, with Oklahoma, Arizona, and New Mexico not far behind as America entered the 20th century. The railroads even affected the way Americans tell time. Prior to the 1880s, each American town had its own time determined by the sun's position in the sky. This was a nightmare for the railroad companies, so on November 18, 1883, they announced the implementation of time zones, which would split the country into 4 regions with time staggered by the hour. Most American communities adopted this system immediately. More than any other industry, railroad construction was behind the creation of millionaires. Cornelius Vanderbilt was just one of the many railroad tycoons, later referred to as robber barons, of the industrial age. Others included Thomas Clark Durant, a builder of the Union Pacific Railroad, Jay Gould, pictured above, who helped construct the Erie Railroad and became the 9th richest American in history, Jim Fisk, Russell Sage, and William H. Vanderbilt, Cornelius's son. These men were able to play the railroads in the Wall Street Stock Exchange, and as time went on, their tricks became dirtier. One of their tricks was stock watering, which involved inflating claims about a line's assets and selling stocks for far more than they were worth. This forced railroad managers to charge incredibly high rates and become incredibly competitive with each other to meet their financial obligations. Individual interests were crushed as railroad barons bribed judges, journalists, politicians, and legislatures, employed persuasive lobbyists, and placed some of their best men in government positions to promote their agendas. Railroad barons came to have more power over the people than even the president. They would pool profits when dividing business in certain areas and forge alliances with powerful shippers to ensure steady traffic. Small farmers got the short end of the stick in this deal, causing them to promote the Populist Party in the 1890s. As resentment of the railroads grew among poor farmers, so did the need for government intervention. However, Americans were not too inclined to act, as the railroads were making the country incredibly prosperous. The story of the railroad tycoons placed hope in the hearts of those who believed in the American dream, that anyone could become a millionaire in the United States. The Depression in the 1870s caused farmers to join organized agrarian groups, such as the Grange, aka the Patrons of Husbandry. Meanwhile, many Midwestern legislatures did their best to regulate the railroad monopoly. Finally, the U.S. Supreme Court stepped in 1886 in Wabash, St. Louis, and the Pacific Railroad Company versus Illinois, which declared that states could not control interstate commerce. It was up to the federal government to halt the iron horse. Against the wishes of a reluctant Grover Cleveland, Congress passed the Interstate Commerce Act in 1887, which forbade rebates in pools and forced the railroads to publicly publish their rates. It also prohibited unfair discrimination against shippers and tried to regulate the charges set forth by railroad companies. Created to enforce this law was the Interstate Commerce Commission. The Interstate Commerce Act created a way in which competing business interests could peaceably resolve their issues and stabilize the business system. This was the first major federal attempt at regulating business for the sake of the public. As Americans entered the 20th century, the government would work even harder to oversee and control the railroads and the private economy at large. The end was in sight for the wheeling and dealing of the robber barons. By the time Theodore Roosevelt became president, the Interstate Commerce Commission had turned out to be thoroughly inadequate. Railroad tycoons had the ability to appeal to the Commission's decisions on rates to the federal courts, which could lead to a 10-year process. Congress, at Roosevelt's persuasion, passed the Elkins Act in 1903, which imposed heavy fines on both the railroads distributing rebates and shippers that accepted them. 3 years later, Congress passed the Hepburn Act of 1906, which severely restricted free passes used as bribes. The Interstate Commerce Commission was then expanded to cover express companies, sleeping car companies, and pipelines. It could now, on the complaint of shippers and upon authorization, nullify existing rates and control maximum rates. Roosevelt, a known trustbuster, also took the opportunity to confront the Northern Securities Company, a railroad holding company led by J.P. Morgan and James J. Hill, in 1902. Morgan and Hill had been trying to create a virtual monopoly of the Northwestern railroads. The railway promoters appealed to the Supreme Court, which ruled in favor of Roosevelt's antitrust suit. The Northern Securities Company was forced to dissolve in 1904. Eventually, trains were overshadowed by air travel and personal automobiles, but the railroad's impact on American society cannot be forgotten. It is because of the railroads that the American West is part of the Union. The United States economy faced a marvelous boom at the hands of the railroads, which were responsible for transporting raw materials, manufactured goods, and workers. The railroads gave us time zones. The millionaires created by the railroad industry caused the government to begin cracking down on American monopolies, and not a moment too soon. Without the railroads, America may have been a very different place.